And on that note, it is my pleasure to welcome Sarah Knowles, Master of Wine tonight. Sarah, are you there?
Hi, Tim. I'm here, definitely. Thank you all for having me. And I should always start a Zoom with an apology. I live right by 6 different train lines that run into London Bridge, and there is often a train every minute and a half. So apologies in advance for the background noise that you may hear. But hopefully tonight we will whip through 6 delicious Italian wines, all of which, as Tim said, were featured in Champs. And you'll forget about the trains very quickly. So the Champs tastings this year happened in a very, very different process. So actually we usually as buyers all meet and we try and maximize the number of buyers who are available to come in and taste around 1,000 wines. And we more or less try to taste everything that is on sale or that is a real sort of heavyweight listing wine for us. So anything that does a little bit of volume over the year. And we taste them in categories over about, it feels like 100 different tastings, but it must only be about sort of 15, 16 tastings. And we taste about 40 to 100 wines in each of those sessions. And usually in Champs, we're all crowded around in our tasting room. We're all spitting into various different spittoons. There could be up to 8 or 9 of us in the tasting room at once. And it's a fairly fun environment to be in, dynamic. We're all chatting, we're all saying whether we like a wine or not. We try and not influence too many people because we're tasting blind, but it's always wonderful to hear, you know, Sebastian guffaw at some point, or I might spit something out a little quicker than normal if it's not particularly nice, and all of those sorts of things. So we're very used to tasting as a group. And this year, approaching how to do this with some sort of level of COVID security and social distancing in mind, it presented a great number of challenges for us. So Matthew Horsley, my fellow buyer, is more or less responsible for setting up the Champs tastings. And he came up with his sort of list of possible rules for this year's setup. And so usually as a minimum number of buyers, we always need 5 for it to be quorum for a Champs score. This year, we decided that 5 would become not only our minimum, but also our maximum, so that we could reduce the number of people in the room. We also moved the tasting out of the tasting room and into, some of you may know it, but the members room, which at Stevenage is a much larger room where we often host dinners for members, and where thankfully there are 8 large round tables. And so each buyer got their own table to sit at and stay still at whilst tasting the wines. But then we needed the help of our colleagues. And this is actually where the tastings team came to the fore. And Catherine and Gil, who I'm sure many of you will know, volunteered or were roped in, whichever story you'll believe, but they came to help pour and open all the wines so that we didn't mix too much, so that we weren't, we didn't have lots of people standing up and moving around the room and touching different bottles and glasses and all the rest of it. So all the buyers had a tray of glasses. We were responsible for our own glasses and took them home each night in our cars to wash up and brought them the next morning so that we were the only ones touching them. We would put our glasses on one side of a plastic screen situated on the tables. Catherine and Gil would come around and pour the wines around sort of 6 to 12 at a time, sort of in mini flights. And we would then taste the wines blind, sat behind our screens. We were also spitting into different spittoons. It's a horrible thing to think of, and I'm sorry if any of you are eating, but we couldn't, we couldn't risk, if any of us were ill, potentially spitting into a spittoon and that then contaminating or hurting somebody else. So we started spitting into terribly horrid camping toilet bags, which have an amazing amount of liquid. They have gel grains at the bottom that absorb the liquid and allowed us to sort of spit much more safely. Everything got absorbed. We were able to tie up those bags in a very efficient way. And we had to then be responsible for disposing of those at the end of each of the shifts. So it was a very odd looking Champs, from something that's usually very convivial and very close to something that was quite sterile and distanced, but it had some great advantages. I think all of us as a buying team felt that we gave the wines quite a lot of more consideration because we were sat, focused, it was very calm and quiet, and we were really able to study the wines. We also all had the major tastings for our regions as the sort of must-attend tastings. So we all got the added benefit of the usual kind of tasting of our range, hearing others' opinions on it, and seeing whether we should be delisting anything. Because not only do we come out with champs, but we also every year always find one or two wines that we're a little disappointed in and that we decide to delist following the event. So a few stats, I think I've got some here. With Italy, we had sort of 3 major tastings. Italy whites go into 2 different tastings, what we call the miscellaneous 1 and miscellaneous 2. And it's more or less lots of different white grape varieties from Italy, Portugal, Spain, and then those varieties planted elsewhere in the world. And we try and differentiate between those that are very aromatic and those that are slightly less aromatic, so that the tasting, when we see them combined, is a little bit more straightforward for us to judge. We also then have a whole session or a day that is dedicated to Italian reds in its own right. We also have a similar day dedicated to things like Rhone reds or Bordeaux blends. So it's not a crazy thing for us to be doing. But we tasted just under 100 Italian wines in the 3 sessions. We had how many winners? We had 16 Italian champs in the end, including the Moscato d'Asti, which I believe is one of our most champed wines every year without fail. It's also perhaps a little bit tough because, of course, it's quite a clear style of wine, and we're perhaps not tasting it as blind as some of the others, because we are, of course, able to, or at least you'd hope that we'd be able to recognize it blind, and we all happen to love it. But it did look fantastic this year. The Society's Barbera, which we've got in our lineup, also is a serial winner in our tastings. We often think it's because it offers such a crunchy style at such an attractive price point, and we're always very impressed blind when we come to it. And I'll discuss that more when we taste it, because actually it's one of the wines in the run that sometimes we get quite mixed reviews on. So it's interesting to sort of see where the buyers' tastes lie and how we then need to be able to communicate that to members so that we tell you accurately what the wines may taste like before you buy them. I've seen Tim appear on my screen. I think that means there might be a question.
No, so I was just going to say, we've actually got a lot of members saying that they've got a lot of the wines open. So before we come back to what actually, just explain the process a bit more, could we maybe start with the first wine tonight?
Definitely. Lots of thirsty members. Apologies. So I was cheating because I already have a glass in front of me. So we're starting with the Mandara Rossa Vermentino, which I have here. Please do dig in, crack open a bottle, pour yourself a glass, relax. It is Thursday evening now, it's 7 o'clock. We can definitely start. So please have a little drink while I continue. But no, the champs tasting this year was one where Italy actually did rather better than usual. So we were pretty delighted at the number of winners, and within the offer you'll see that there's been a little sort of feature on Italian wines, because we were really impressed with the value that's coming out of Italy. And a lot of these, I say value because a lot of these wines are not overly expensive. So they are very good wines, but what they're really offering is character and something quite interesting that really stood out blind for us as we were tasting. And happened to be Italian, which is wonderful for me as your Italian buyer, because of course this offer is hugely popular. So wines that make it into this offer can sometimes do a significantly more volume than they would ever do normally. And I'll talk a little bit more to that when we get to the Vallone wine that we've got later. So yes, it's an interesting opportunity for some of the wines when they win. But speaking to the process a little bit more, those of us that are European buyers often complain at the timings of this tasting, because especially for the whites, as we talk about the Vermentino, getting our samples together in February to taste blind, knowing that those will be the wines and the blends that will be accurate and true to this the offer, which happens, of course, in August, can be very tricky because, of course, the vintage only happens in sort of September, October in Europe. And then the wines take, most sort of winemaking schedules will leave the wines fermenting for a few weeks and then leave them in tank to settle over Christmas. Not just because Christmas is a nice time not to be working too hard, but because the wines really benefit from sitting on the fine lees that they're left on, usually in tank. Or if they're red wines, they've then been moved to barrel. But with the white wines that are going to be nice and fresh, usually the sort of European standard would be to bottle those around Easter, so that they're then ready for the spring or ready for the summer. And we're always asking as buyers to try and get pre-bottled samples sent to us in February. And we start that conversation in January so that we have plenty of wine for the tasting. So it means that quite frequently, as a buying team, we feel that the New World or the European whites, sometimes we don't get all the samples that we want into the tasting at the right time. And we end up tasting 2019 samples, which often look great, but the stock will run out before the offer. And you'd think that in a retail organization, we might give that winery a bit of a pass and allow them to have the wine in the offer if their previous vintage did well. But the Wine Champs offer has a real core of integrity at the heart, and we don't. So it has to be the same blend and the same vintage that we taste. So I was delighted when I managed to get samples of the Mandara Rossa Vermentino here in time for February, the correct blend, the right vintage for us to taste early so that we could include it if it came good. And of course it did. Tim, I believe we've got a little bit of a PowerPoint. We might put up a few images while we have a look at the Vermentino. Oh, maybe not. Catherine or Tim? I'm good. I'm not alone. Sometimes I think that the Wi-Fi may have just dropped out. So looking at Italy, first of all, I think I can't stress sort of strongly enough why Italy might be home to this sort of huge number of indigenous varieties and why it's a perfect place for wine to grow, for grapes to grow. As you will all know the map of Italy, so I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but you can see very clearly that it's surrounded by seas on all sides. Grapes do very well when they're moderated or when the climate is moderated by the ocean. So a number of the major growing regions for Italy are coastal. You can also see here the mountains. So to the north, we've got, of course, the Alps, and then down the center, there's a sort of spine of Italy that is the Apennine Mountains. And those mountains, coupled with the volcanoes in the south, really create a textured landscape for different grape varieties to find their home. We also then are coupled with a sort of incredible pride that Italians have in local strengths. And you'll find that throughout sort of food as well as wine. But if you travel in Italy, there's thousands of different pasta shapes associated with every different sub-region and small town. And that is the same with the grapes. So Italians never felt that they should homogenize. So they didn't see a grape variety doing very well in the north or very well in the south and think to plant it everywhere. Instead, they very much stuck to what is grown locally, what was known within their region, within the sub-region, even just within their town. And they have honed the skills on making those indigenous grape varieties perfectly, so that now it is available across Italy. And today we're able to taste all 6 different grape varieties, in fact 7 grape varieties here. So if we go back, Tim, there's a couple of slides of books, because before we crack on, the big books that I would highly recommend and that I have on my desk at all times would be this pair of books. So Italy's Native Wine Grapes and Native Wine Grapes of Italy, both by Ian Dagata. Ian is an ex-medic from the States who has been based in Rome for 20 plus years now. And he is reasonably, he's probably the world's expert on the grape varieties of Italy, and has, of course, published these incredible tomes of books. He has got documented over 500 different grape varieties in Italy's Native Wine Grape no, in the native wine grapes of Italy. And in his terroirs book, he has more than 700 different subregions and terroirs that he talks about within Italy. And so you can suddenly start to see the layers of complexity, which I think is quite tricky for members in some respect, because we often find great varieties that we've never heard of and can't find again. But we also have the ability to buy from such a wide range of different varieties, which makes it very exciting. And then the next two books are, of course, Nick Belfridge's books, Master of Wine, and a great friend, personal friend of Sebastian Payne. The two of them actually traveled a huge amount together in the 80s, around Italy, buying wines for the Wine Society, and Nicholas was writing his books at the same time. So he does work in the trade and has worked with us many, many times, and we have some great articles on our website by Nicholas that are exceptional. And these two books, again, detail incredible numbers of different great varieties and different regions that they have settled in. And we're really only touching the tip of the iceberg today with these wines and this conversation. I'm always stunned to find myself tasting a wine that even I have never heard of, and that I'm having to crack on with and, Google before or look up in these books before I can introduce it to members. So the Vermentino. So hopefully here, everyone's got a glass now. I think it's $6.75. This is probably one of the best value wines that I ship. And Vermentino is native to a number of different islands and to the mainland in Italy. It's very famous for coming from Sardinia, but is well planted across Sicily. And this one is made for us by Mandara Rossa. Mandara Rossa are one of the cooperatives in Sicily. They've got 2,000 different wine growers, and they cover 6,000 hectares. But the label for Mandara Rossa was created in about 30 years ago, and it's meant to be the best things that they are doing. So this only works with 500 hectares from 160 of the best growers from that 2,000. But because they have such a large cooperative, they have an incredible kind of palette of paints to choose from when they're making these wines. And the Vermentino that they pick is usually always from the vineyards that are closest to the sea, where the sunlight and the moderating sea breezes really help the acidities stay, but the flavors develop. So hopefully, with this wine, you're seeing some lovely freshness, an incredible amount of kind of citrus flavors, perhaps some peach and apricot coming through. It's a very bright, crisp, dry, unoaked white wine, perfect pretty much on its own, but also great match with seafood or with, antipasti. We go with the motto that what grows together goes together. And with Italian wine, that's definitely true. So if you happen to like regional Italian cuisine and you're picking regional Italian wines, they will usually match each other perfectly. So thinking of Sicily and the wonderful seafood that's available, or perhaps arancini and slightly less flavorsome cheeses that melt so deliciously, this would be a perfect match with those. Right, Tim?
So Sarah, I was just going to ask, obviously this is lovely and it's got that zingy, zesty citrus character, as you said, but I poured mine a while ago and it's warmed up, and I would have expected for a relatively cheap wine of this nature that it could have become a little bit flabby and flat if it was served a little bit warm, but this still actually has really nice balance and structure. And is that one of the reasons why it made it through as a champ, do you think?
I think in champs, we often are tasting not necessarily very cold, because it's very hard to manage the temperatures at which the wines come out when we're tasting 50 plus wines in a session. So it probably was tasted at more sort of just under room temperature, and will have held up very well then. I think though the reason it's doing that is because it genuinely has quite fresh acidity. So the wonderful acidity here is really keeping the wine line nice and tight, which otherwise we might rely on chilling for. So no, I'm glad it's looking good. For me, I'm getting quite a lot of that saltiness. So actually that kind of lemon, preserved lemon flavor that is very indicative of these kind of very coastal wines. And actually Vermentino is a great variety, is one of the varieties that can cope with quite high saline levels in the soils. So it can cope with salty marine conditions and hot days, but as long as it gets those cool winds.
And
Yeah.
that salinity, it's something I really enjoy in a lot of wines, but do you find members have a particular threshold for it? Can it be too salty?
No, I think when we're tasting wine, especially when it's very good wine and we're with food and just enjoying it, we tend not to identify that it's salt or the saltiness that we're tasting, because it feels like a bit of an odd flavor to be tasting on a fruity wine. I think it just helps, as it does with food, make everything taste a little bit better and make it go down a bit quicker and easier. So I don't know whether unless we're really over analyzing a wine, as we are in a tasting such as today, that we even notice the salt. I think we just notice it as a very Moorish, savory, fruity, balanced wine. Yeah. Great.
Wonderful. So members, if you have any comments on the wine, if you are tasting, do let us know. But we'll move on to the next wine. I think Catherine will bring up the slides and we'll be able to talk about the Greco.
Great. Okay, I need to prepare. Sadly, I'm pouring away. Let me find the Greco. Bottle over. Great. So this is one of our probably one of our, mine and Seb's, I have to say, favorite suppliers. So Aloe Veni is a wonderful producer based in Basilicata. And if any of you have traveled in southern Italy, Basilicata is more or less where the roads stop being paved. From my experience, it's where I seem to have nearly broken down many times and got very lost. The sat nav doesn't seem to really understand where we're going. Google definitely didn't know where Aronzo Aloe's winery was. And we seemed to circle it 2 or 3 times before we finally made it there on my first visit. And then I sort of saved it very clearly in my Google Maps for next time and sort of marked it on a bit of paper too. But for us, working with Aronzo is fantastic because he set up his own winery in 2003 in this beautiful region of Basilicata, right underneath the volcano Voltur. And he's a very charismatic, accomplished winemaker in a region that perhaps needs more personalities and more skills. And the sort of Greco bunch here that you're seeing is classic. It's this sort of large, quite spaced bunch. You'll see the grapes aren't very close together. And it often has spots, yellow and brown spots on the skin. And it's slightly trickier grape. It needs a skilled winemaker because it actually ripens quite late in October. And so it needs cooler, higher elevation spots, but it also needs quite dry conditions because it's quite prone to rot. So Basilicata is almost perfect in the sort of higher altitude sites that can't grow Aglianico can then be given to Greco. It's nice and hot and dry, and the grapes are able to ripen all the way through into October without ruining too much. It's also quite low vigor. That grape variety, the grape bunch you saw with the grapes quite spaced, means that you're not getting a huge number of, you're not getting great amounts of liquid per bunch when you're pressing your grapes. So it's reasonably, you've got to love Greco to make it. And of course, it says it in the name, it does appear to be originally Greek. But there's a huge debate among all Greco producers in Italy around how long it has to be in Italy for it to become Italian, and the various numbers of clones that have now spawned. And there's a lot of work going into identifying different clones of Greco that really do look quite different from one another when they produce a final wine. And so arguably we're calling it the Greek wine, but it's still fully Italian, I believe. So hopefully quite a marked change to the Vermentino. For me, it's a much showier wine. It's got much more sort of tropical opulence. I really enjoy this style because I like wines that have great perfume. I think Greco has great perfume. You know, it's got dried apricots, mango, kind of pineapple note. On the palate, though, it's still unoaked. Ah, there's the beautiful picture of the volcano. So this is the actually one of Alonso's vineyards. This is actually his Aglianico down here, but as we go up into the hills towards the sort of lower reaching hills of the volcano, he's got his sites for Greco. And of course, there's 7, you can count them, I think, just about on there. There are 7 peaks to the volcano delineating where it's exploded at various points over the last few thousand years. So it is an incredibly beautiful area to visit. And if you enjoy going off-road, I would highly recommend it because there's also some fantastic food in this neck of the woods. Alonso, in fact, has some buffalo. So every time we're there, we also always have some fantastic cheese. But no, so the Greco itself here, I think this is probably an easier style for us to spot in a blind tasting because it's so much more opulent. It's got all that perfume. It's really quite a showy white wine, which I think for its price point really stands out as offering some great value. It's also going to be another easy to pair with food, but hopefully you're finding it quite easy to drink by itself. It does go very well, Greco, with something like a roasted chicken. We can bring in some white meats now because of the extra opulence it has, and it's got a little bit more weight for me on the palate. And so things like pork or roast chicken or meatier fish like tuna would be fantastic, or perhaps roasted mushrooms or some of that hard cheese. By the end of this, we'll all be very hungry. Italian wines are designed for food, so I hope you've got something in the oven, if not already on your plate. Okay.
So Sarah, you're mentioning that it's one that's relatively a bit easier to spot. Would have this been served in the aromatic category, or was it?
Yes. Yeah. So this was on the aromatic day. So it would have been surrounded by. It actually would have had things like Viognier on the same table, and all the way up to Gewürz and things like that. So we have quite a plethora of wines on the aromatic day, whereas the Vermentino would have been in our slightly less aromatic day, which then would have also included some Gruners and bits and bobs like that. So no, it's every year, I think as a buying team, we debate the logic of how we're breaking up these categories for the white wine grapes. And we change it every year, and we disagree each year consecutively to retry something different the next year. I don't think we've ever felt as a team that we get it spot on. But Matthew has done a remarkable job at trying to juggle all of the different requirements and asks around the different grape varieties and their, appearance. Even something like Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, should we taste them on the same day? Are they in the same? Are they in the same flight? They're made so differently depending on how we look at that grape variety. So it's a bit of a minefield, but we do our best and we take our time. And of course, Pierre often reminds us, or I think Sebastian says it quite frequently too, this is our job. We're buyers, we taste for a living. We should be able to taste wines in whichever order they come and still spot the good ones. So we do our best.
Martin from our fine wine team has popped in a question asking about the ageability of this wine, noting that the back label says it's got excellent potential for aging. I think I'm certainly guilty of normally associating most Italian whites as quite young, fresh drinking styles. For this wine in particular, how would this develop with time?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough when I visited Alonso to try a few older Grecos of his, and it does age. This isn't going to be a disaster if you have it in a cupboard on a wine rack and forget about it for a few years. But it tends to develop that sort of honeyed note and that slightly more oily texture, and loses some of the primary fruit and becomes perhaps a little bit more almondy and develops some of those nutty flavors. I'm terrible, I think, really, when it comes to these lovely, vibrant wines when young, because I tend to think that is when they're showing best. So I think although it will age, I will be drinking my Greco within a year of its production and trying very much to get the next vintage online quickly, but giving it a reasonable drink window to allow members, if they prefer the style, to be a little bit fuller, a little bit more honeyed, and a little less of that primary fruit to keep it in their wine rack a little bit longer. But for me, I'm perhaps with you. I love the vibrancy of Greco in its youth, especially this wine. Although we're now looking at the 2020 harvest is only going to be 6-7 weeks away in this neck of the woods for this variety, and so oh no, of course not. This is going to be later in October. Where are we? 8 weeks away. So yes, it's holding. It's already done sort of 9 months in bottle, so it's not in its quickest bottled sense. So it's showing some development already.
And we've had a couple of questions come through asking about how price is factored into the Champs tastings. And am I right? It's not completely blind tastings. You do taste in price brackets, but
so we want to taste as we would buy. So there is no point as tasting a £40 wine and saying that it was fantastic, assuming it was £8.50, and then discovering it was £40. That wouldn't be a champ. We're expecting something different from something at £40 to something at £8.50. And we taste in categories. So it's not in price order strictly, because we try to do it in a tasting order, but we will taste within a category of price point. So perhaps under 10, under 15, under 20, that sort of bracket. But we will, we're not a stickler for sticking to round numbers. So we will work to whatever makes sense for the number of wines we're looking at and the category that we're looking at. But it's a different question. So we really taste the wines for Champs, saying which wine would we take home tonight? Like, what is drinking really well now? What shows stunning value? What's exciting? And most of the wines that we taste are very good. We give them a score. They're fine. They're great listed wines. They're going to do all of the things we need them to do. They might be classics. All of it. Lots of Chiantis that look great. Lots of Riojas that look great. Lots of Clarets, but only 1 or 2 are Champs, and they're the ones that stand out in that tasting for a combination of reasons. But price is considered.
Thank you for that. Now, please keep the comments and the questions coming through, but I think we might move on to the reds. And the reds was difficult in terms of exactly what tasting order we would go through, but I think for tonight we're starting with the back down in Sicily with the Nero d'Avola.
Fantastic. So we're back in Sicily, and surprisingly for Nero, we're on the west side, or we're on the southwest side. So often the red grape varieties are often known for being around Avola, the town that Nero d'Avola comes from. And that's down sort of more central, eastern, south, near Syracuse, for those of you that have traveled to Sicily. Whereas Fuedo and Tro are set over in the west a little bit. Here we go. So they're sort of between the two. If we look at the bottom of the map, just disappearing off the chart, is down towards where Syracuse and Noto are, and the kind of more famous area for the red wines. But here they have the advantage that Nero d'Avola is now planted extremely well across Sicily, but they have some hill sites here. So they've been able to put the Nero onto some of the hills. So instead of getting the coastal breeze, they're instead getting some of that altitude. That is not very common across Sicily. So there are the volcanoes that you can, that we all know about in Sicily, but actually finding these sorts of lovely slopes can be a little bit tricky. And this is the beautiful winery. So it's actually a very new winery, which has a lot of advantages for us in that it has every modcon and every technology that we could ask for, but they built it in a very traditional Sicilian style of a sort of very grand manor house containing the winery. And this is because this is made by a northern company called Mezza Corona, who are actually a quite large cooperative based up in Trentino. And they have invested in Sicily. So they bought these vines, they bought the land, they built the winery, they brought a winemaker in, and they really focused on making very high quality, very consistent wines in Sicily, which is where Sicily historically had some problems. So historically, you could try a wine in Sicily, and the wine that you received 6 months later was not even the same color. You would be very worried that something had gone wrong in transport. You weren't necessarily getting the consistency that you needed. And a large proportion of Sicily's production has traditionally always been sold in bulk to the mainland for very inexpensive table wine served across Italy and pretty much labeled as anything the Italians feel that it should be labeled as. So it's got a lot of sort of slightly risky history as a winemaking region, and working with this remarkably efficient northern Italian company based in Sicily was one of the ways that Sebastian before me discovered that he could find really fantastically consistent, very high quality wines to stock. And yes, they do make the Society Sicilian Reserve. So these are the same people. This is their younger Nero d'Avola though. Yeah, and I think in our blind tasting really did stand out for just being one of those extremely Moorish, soft, fun red wines that we were able to just instantly give high scores to, because it really had such appeal. At Fuero Antro, they have 700 hectares of vines, so it's quite a large estate, but they grow a large number of different vines, and they only have about 100 hectares of Nero d'Avola, but it's entirely looked after by them. They don't buy grapes in, so this is an estate wine. And again, it means that they've got this incredible control over the quality of the grapes coming in, because often Nero d'Avola, arguably, depending on the style you like, but for me, often it can be picked a little bit late. And it can also be grown to quite high yield. And here they're usually picking at optimal ripeness, which I feel is when the acidity hasn't started to drop off, but when the flavors and the fruit profile is still very bright and very ripe. But they're also reducing the yields earlier in the season. So they do quite a strong green harvest, which really pulls the yields down and allows the berries that they leave to concentrate in terms of flavor. And so for me, this wine, again, at I think a really competitive price, shows something quite exciting about what Italy can really put forward.
And Sarah, with this one, where you're talking there about the freshness, serving temperature for a wine like this, where would you recommend?
I think we debate serving temperatures quite a lot, and we often try and come up with precise numbers at which we should serve wines. And I had an interaction recently, I think it was on the community possibly even, or with a member who felt that by not giving very accurate guides, we were potentially letting the membership down in not being able to enjoy the wine at the optimal temperature. And actually, speaking to all the buyers, none of us really own thermometers. We're not checking the temperature of our wine. We're not playing that game, but we all have a sense that we know when a wine is too hot or too cold. And we tend to err on the side of chilling most wines. So we will chill whites and accept the idea that we can warm them up if they've got too cold. And equally with reds, especially in temperatures like this. So I have a little thermometer in my flat, although I don't do the wines, and I'm at 26 degrees and 40% humidity in my apartment. And I've chilled all the reds. So I put them all in the fridge for an hour, and I'm accepting the idea that with just my hand on the glass, I can easily warm them to the right temperature for me for drinking. But it's a personal preference, and so it's the temperature that you feel you're enjoying the wine at, rather than the temperature that I feel we should dictate out. But I know that the buying team definitely feel that perhaps, especially in the summer, we're all drinking wines a little bit too warm, the red wines. And so we're all putting them in the fridge for a little bit, just so that they're a little bit more fresh.
Wonderful. So I think we might now jump up to the north of the country and go to the Society's Barbera. But please do have questions about any of the specific wines. Do keep on sending them in, and we'll be able to cover them at the end of the night if we haven't covered them as we go along. Yeah.
So yes, indeed, up to the north. So we're in Piedmont with the Barbera d'Asti, and it's the Society's Barbera d'Asti. And I was saying earlier that this is actually a a wine that has won multiple times. But perhaps and I have to say, I don't describe it accurately enough. I sort of try and in the note put that it's a medium-bodied wine, and because I sometimes think that we expect Barbera to be a little bit fuller in all guises, and actually at this sort of price point, and from this producer as Barbera d'Asti, it's actually quite a medium to light red, and it tends to come with quite sort of. Barbera is often also known for not having huge tannins, but I think everything is relative. I think Barbera doesn't have a lot of tannins relative to Nebbiolo in the same region. And so we talk about it being low in tannins, but actually Barbera for me usually has quite good structure and it has very good acidity. So Barbera can be a little bit of a Marmite wine. Some people really find that combination quite tricky or expecting something a little bit richer. More aligned to the Nero d'Avola that we tried earlier. But this is made for us by Araldica. Araldica are another cooperative based up in Asti, and they have about 140 members, all of whom have vineyards. They're known for being one of the better cooperatives in Piedmont, and they really focus on traditional varieties and the best sites. So this wine comes from just 3 different vineyards that consistently produce the wine that we need and like. And they're really good about allowing us to taste it every year and to be involved in the blending process because this is under our own label. All of our society and exhibition wines are wines which the buyers definitely spend a greater proportion of our time on. We know that they have our name on, and we know that we should be very clued in with the blend and the winemaking behind them. And so this is an important thing for us, that the winemaker allows us to have that sort of fingers in pies and that visibility, so that we can guarantee that it's something that we really feel that you're going to enjoy. So Barbera was actually the 3rd biggest planted variety in Italy after Sangiovese and Montepulciano as of 2000. So there's a lot of Barbera across Italy, and it's drunk a huge amount up and down the country as that sort of everyday wine. So when we're in Piedmont traveling, everybody talks about Nebbiolo, and we spend all of our time looking at Barolos and Barbarescos and discussing vintage and nuances around that grape variety. But actually, in the restaurants in Piedmont or in every winemaker's homes, what they're drinking every night is Barbera. And I think it's because Barbera can really be a great medium, lighter drinking wine for that doesn't need food, but can also, because of its high acid, cut through quite a lot of fat. So hopefully, that was a lovely picture of the grape variety. When you're in Piedmont, if you travel in the autumn to Piedmont, you will see that some of the vineyards have turned red, and that's always the Barbera. So the leaves for the Barbera vines tend to go red much earlier than others, and so you can see the patches of red Barbera relative to the Nebbiolo that is usually sort of greener for longer or more yellowing.
Sarah, tasting this, I really get that sense of that medium light body that you mentioned, but I suspect some members might be put off by the alcohol on this wine being at 14.5%. It's not a wine that tastes high in alcohol, but having that on the label, is that a characteristic of Barbera?
It's a characteristic of Barbera, but it's also a characteristic of Piedmont. So the alcohol volumes for Barbera and for Nebbiolo are usually 14 plus. There's very little made under 14% from any of the major producers. I think the most recent Barolo on Premier offer was 14.5 across the board pretty much. And I believe that the exhibition Lange that we have at the end is 15. So it is part of this area and the way in which the grapes develop. So it's the simple calculation between the amount of sugar that ends up in the grape variety relative to the water that's in the grape variety, because we're fermenting it out. And so it is what it is. But I think with both wines, it hides it extremely well. They're very balanced, and we seem to get very concerned within the wine world about the sort of nuance of 1% of alcohol. And of course, I also buy spirits for the Wine Society. And I see the opposite side there where members get, or not members perhaps, but the trade gets very upset when a gin is reduced to 38% from 42 or 46. And it's almost the opposite. People want more alcohol in their spirits, especially craft spirits that tend to be very high in alcohol. Of course, craft beers have also gone quite high in alcohol. And it's because higher alcohol holds more flavour. It has more perfume. It is the part of the wine that's escaping the glass the quickest. And so the higher the alcohol in the liquid you're drinking, the more flavoursome it's going to be on your initial smell. So I think we can get very worried about 13% or 15%, but really it's nuanced amounts of difference at this point. And I think here the 14.5 is barely noticeable at all. Hopefully others are seeing that this is quite in balance. And what's really coming through for me on tasting is actually just the tart nature of the fruit, which I think is a very Italian commonality across red wines. I think even with the Nero d'Avola that was fuller and riper, it still had some tartness, like that cranberry or sour cherry note that seems to be very prevalent. It was always a marker for me when I was blind tasting within exam conditions for Italian wines. If you get a lot of acidity, lots of tartness, usually a lot of structure, you're probably in Italy.
And then we're about to move on to a wine that is a blend, but does Barbera get blended at all?
Some winemakers are blending Barbera. So we have a couple of wines that are Barbera Nebbiolo blends, but it's a rarity rather than the rule. I think both grape varieties are so revered in their own right, especially Nebbiolo, that it's not widely done. No.
Wonderful. So a couple of positive comments about the wine, so always great to see. But we might jump back down south now to a winery that's possibly one of my favourite wineries that we work with at the Wine Society. It's
Aloe.
Yeah.
These guys are a beautiful winery and a great partner for us to work with. And they're a family-run business, so somebody that we can really sit down and have dinner with, as it was. And it was set up by two sisters, and actually their nephew is now running the show at the winery. They have about 170 hectares of vines, but they have a much larger estate in Puglia that is completely stunning, about 650 hectares. That they've mainly got lots of olive groves on and various agricultural products like aubergines or melons. They also have wild stock, so they've got horses and they've got sheep, and then they've got chickens, and then they have 170 hectares of vines. And a lot of their vines are hugely are really in demand because they're such old vines and they've been planted for a long time. And a lot of them are bush vines that again now sort of look after themselves. And it feels like as we get more extreme weather conditions, that the older vines cope with weather condition changes more easily because they've perhaps got deeper roots and they're more in tune with the local environment, and they're able to kind of weather the very hot days or the difficult kind of rainy days better. And this is Castel Seranova, which is one of their outlying properties on these 700 hectares, where they've named a couple of wines specifically to this from the grapes that grow around it. And it is a blend. So this is Negro Amaro, which is literally translated to black and bitter. So it is a very dark black colored grape, and it does have that classic Italian bitterness to it. It also is a blend with the much rarer and very local Susa Manuelo, which is a native grape to Puglia. It's grown almost exclusively in this sub-region of Puglia, Silice, Salento, and it's really just in a tiny number of vineyards. This is very close to Brindisi, if anybody has traveled around Puglia, and it's one of the rarest grape varieties in Italy, let alone globally. but it's had quite a resurgence of popularity recently as winemakers have rediscovered old vines and looked for something here that is going to complement Negro Amaro, so to push in a blend or to make on its own. And you can get quite a lot of Manuelo rosés as well if you're traveling locally. And so it often has, Negro Amaro is known for being a much fuller, dark, rich red wine that has this sort of almost tart black cherry, Black Forest Gatto kind of flavors to it, especially if the winemaker's chosen to use some oak. And then Manuelo is more of those red flavors, red berries, plums. It's spicier, it has more peppery notes. But it also has often, for me, a sort of cocoa nib or raw chocolate, kind of dark chocolate note. And that tends to come regardless of oak use, so from the grape. And here with the blend, I think they've ended up with a wine that's greater than the sum of its parts.
When you think of Southern Italian wines, you generally associate that full-bodied richness and that quite ripe fruit and sometimes overripe fruit. Yet this doesn't steer that way, does it?
No, and wonderfully for Vallone's style more generally, there's always great attention to detail around keeping the acidity in these grapes. So all of the grapes really are picked exactly when they need to be to retain acidity and to keep that freshness. A lot of the Vallone wines, the 100% Negro Amaros that we stock are 13 or 13.5 relative to the further north where you'd expect perhaps lighter alcohols from the Barbera at 14.5 and Nebbiolo at 15. But here, I think the combination of that rich, darker fruit, Negro Amaro, and the slightly more medium tart red fruit has created a really well-balanced blend that has some of that generosity. It's very easy to drink. Again, it would probably be very easy without food, but it's going to pair well with food because it's still got that bitterness, that great acidity, and some of the tannins from the Negro Amaro are starting to really come through.
Wonderful comments. I see one member's off to the region next. Oh no, was there last week and enjoyed the wine. So very, very jealous of that.
Yes.
But I think given the time, we will move on to the last wine where we're going back up to Piedmont region and now to the Nebbiolo grape, to a wine that is relatively new to the portfolio. Is that right?
Yes, so the 2018 is the first vintage of this this exhibition label, although we've been working with the winemaker Enrico at Rizzi for far longer. Enrico, again, Rizzi is another family winery, family-owned winery, and the name of their winery actually comes from the name of the hill that they're just based near, which is also one of the Barbaresco crew. So Rizzi is the name of the crew in the hill, and the name of their winery because they have quite a large vineyard located within the crew. Enrico and his sister are now the two running the business, and they're making an incredible job of it. So they've really brought, Enrico has brought a sense of real elegance and perfume, I think, to all of his wines. And I'm always very impressed when I taste the Nebbiolos that he has. This is actually a declassified, essentially Barbaresco. So he only has vineyards within the Barbaresco area, and he would be able to make this Langhe Nebbiolo a Barbaresco if he kept it at his winery for slightly longer. So there are release rules around what makes Barbaresco. It needs to have a delimited period in oak and a period in barrel before it's released for sale. And this has slightly less time in oak. The oak here, though, is very large, old oak formats, and it does have a little bit of time in oak before it has time in bottle and released. But the Langhe designation is what I was quite interested in. So we actually used to work with Enrico on an exhibition of Barbaresco, but we found that it didn't do brilliantly with members, I think because it was slightly higher priced than our exhibition Barolo. And although we felt that the quality was very good and that the two wines had great difference, so justified their different listings, it wasn't the most popular with members, and we decided to sort of rethink what we could be doing with Rizzi. And working with the Lange was something that I was quite excited about, because I think this regional designation of Nebbiolo is something that Piedmont needs. I think Piedmont needs to be able to create Nebbiolos that are approachable and that are young and that have great perfume and that are inexpensive, or at least are not overly expensive, which is perhaps the best way of putting it. So I think for under £15 to get an introduction to this quite tricky grape variety for many is a wonderful thing. So to speak a little bit more to Nebbiolo, often when I visited Piedmont, it's always been in the autumn, because we're tasting the new Barolos and Barbarescos from barrel, and I need to do that at a certain time of year just before Christmas, so that I can get the offer together. But the interesting thing is that it's invariably always been foggy. So when I visited, it's always had this incredible fog, and it sits in the vineyards really quite oppressively. But it's really important to the way in which the grapes grow and the climate of the local region is. And it's known in Italy as in Italian as nebbia, the fog. And so Nebbiolo is the grape variety in the fog. It traditionally has very light color. So blind, it often looks a bit like Pinot Noir. But of course, it's got incredibly large tannins, or chunky tannins, quite structured. And it probably is one of the wines globally that has the most identifiable structure when tasting blind. It also has very high acidity. And so the combination of those quite firm tannins and high acid can mean that Nebbiolo isn't a wine that everybody loves. It can be a wine that can be quite tricky for people to get into, and they feel that they wanted something a little bit more soft and a little bit easier to enjoy. But the real joy of great Nebbiolo, great Barolo, great Barbaresco, Gamay, Gattinara is the perfume. And here, I really think that for an inexpensive Nebbiolo, we've managed to keep that incredible perfume note. So here, there's lots of roses. Rose and tar is often the kind of traditional idea of being able to describe how these wines taste. But I think it's all about the sort of floral. So the rose and the violets. I often get black tea from this. So it's a very sort of savory floral flavor rather than being dominated by fruit. And I think that, again, can be something that isn't necessarily, the first thing a new wine drinker might want to have in a wine. So I'm really hopeful that a wine like this will be a great introduction to Nebbiolo more generally, and to allow members confidence to explore these fantastic wines that can need time when spending a little bit more money to really open up.
So speaking of time, Sarah, obviously this is one that you've given a drink date to 2024, but as a variety, is the intention with the Lange Nebbiolo to have an earlier drinking one that is a little bit more approachable?
Absolutely. So I think it's a very clear decision that the winemaker is making in deciding which should be, for Enrico, what's going to be his Barbaresco and what's going to be his Lange. And the Barbaresco is usually from the wines that are not as perfumed immediately, but have great intensity of flavor and a real ripeness and sweet core that will age beautifully and will last 20, 30, 40 years. Nebbiolo is one of the wines that can really age for a very long time. So looking for a good Lange is something that actually I think should be drunk a little bit sooner. And I probably have given this, did you say 2024? So I've probably been a little mean, but I'm enjoying it now. So I think it should be drunk now. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we've had a question asked saying, I've had this wine before, it's very nice, but why do we have to pay so much for Barolo? So
a lot of it comes down to the size of the vineyards that we're talking about. So Barolo is very easy to sort of describe when thinking of Burgundy. So we're talking about quite small average size of plots, quite small vineyards, a high number of winemakers making a small number of bottles each. And that sort of drives pricing up. Of course, it's also a market sort of led exercise when we get to all fine wines. And the global market has gone crazy for Barolo in the last 10 years. But I think it's only going to go crazier. So I think actually at the moment, these will be the best prices we ever see Barolo and Barbaresco and other Piedmont fine wines at. I think that over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll see prices really rack up as the world realizes that this is a fine wine region to be taken seriously and should be included in all serious wine drinkers' cellars. So it's only going north. It's not a good news story, but it is, at least we're there as it's still rising rather than at its peak. So unlike Burgundy, I hope you're still able to afford some of the top producers from this region, and we'll keep them in our cellars and drink them in 30, 40 years when at least I won't be able to afford them anymore.
The exhibition range and I guess the Langi region does provide that gateway for members to explore, as you say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful. And some food pairings with this wine?
So the classic food pairing with all Nebbiolo is truffles, but it's not necessarily the most handy for a Thursday night in the UK in the middle of summer. But things like a wonderful mushroom risotto or a good steak, something that either has a lot of protein or a lot of those sort of similar sort of more foresty, earthy flavors tend to go really well with Nebbiolo.
Wonderful. So we do have a poll that we're going to put up for members that have been either tasting multiple wines or would, I guess, which wine they're most likely to purchase or the one they're most intrigued by. So I would love you to answer that. I'll just put that up now. But yeah, so any comments about Italian wine in general, the feeling that you're getting from the producers about the future?
Yeah, no, I think we're really entering into a very exciting time for wine drinkers looking at Italy, because I think talking to Sebastian and looking back a number of years at Italian wine, there's been more inconsistency in winemaking, and Italy has often been sort of tarred with the brush of being a bit rustic, and having, perhaps not taken it as seriously as they should, because they're often selling the vast majority of their wine very quickly locally. So they don't necessarily need to export a huge amount, or didn't need to export a huge amount. But actually, in the last, I think, 30 years, there has been a complete turnaround, and none of the wineries we're working with could ever be described as rustic anymore. They are extremely well kitted out and have a real sense of knowledge and pride and expertise in their local area. And a number of them have also traveled. So many of the winemakers in Italy that I work with have done vintages abroad, whether that's France, Germany, New Zealand, Australia. They have traveled. They have now really dedicated themselves to making a really outstanding luxury product. And I think then they're in a position to that we can all massively enjoy, but that's unrivaled, because they have access to 500 plus indigenous grape varieties, so many of which we haven't seen what their sort of zenith could be, with all the right winemaking conditions and techniques and skill. And they're all planted in beautiful sites in incredible kind of old vine conditions. They really just need people to embrace them again. So I'm consistently stunned at the number of great wines that I'm seeing. It's very hard to list everything that I enjoy. And we try and list a lot of different things across the board. So you'll find with the Italian range that I solely focus on Italian grape varieties. Sebastian before me felt that there is just no point us buying Merlot from Sicily. You can buy it elsewhere, and that's not what Sicily is exciting for. They may make great Merlot, but that's not what we're after. We're after the incredible stories of these interesting grape varieties and finding great winemakers to make them.
Wonderful. And that, as you say, that was really the purpose of tonight, was to highlight these Indigenous varieties and to bring them to members. And they can be tricky sometimes to get your head around. They're difficult to say. They're difficult to place in where they sit in your wine rack. But hopefully, by being able to taste or talk about a number of the wines, it's given members an insight. So thank you so much for your time and your experience and expertise and insights into the wines.
A pleasure. Thank you ever so much for having me.
So just quickly with the votes, lovely to see all of the wines get the votes with at least 10% being shared around, but coming out on top was the Verloni, the Salento with 31% of the vote, closely followed by the Greco with 24% of the vote. And then a pretty even split after that. So
I think the Greco on a night like this, the sun is finally shining again in London, at least. It was raining earlier, but the Greco is the one I'm going to be sticking in my glass to finish off. But I will be very uncouth and probably put an ice cube in it because I've saved out the fridge for a bit. So, but I hope in whatever way you enjoy your wines, you enjoy finishing off some of the bottles tonight, or taste some of these bottles if you weren't able to taste them before.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. To the questions I didn't get to, I do apologize, but I just had too many come through. But Sarah was covering a lot of them as we went. So yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, please do let us know. We'll answer them by email and get back to anything that was not covered. You may have received during this presentation an email about our next set of events coming out in the next month. Hopefully you'll be able to join us again. And also some exciting news coming with the return of physical events. So starting with Stevenage in September, then around the country from October. So do keep your eyes peeled for more information about those. Would love to see you in person once again, but don't worry, these virtual events will be carried on. They're not going anywhere. They're very much going to be a part of the program for the future. So no matter where you are, you can join us. Open a glass of wine and have a lovely evening with us. So thank you for those that did that this evening. And thank you once again, Sarah.
Pleasure. See you then, Tim. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers, everybody.